right now, say a lot of the cloud infrastructure that individuals and businesses and even government to a certain degree would be dependent on would be controlled and owned by American companies. We've seen the pressure from the United States and Silicon Valley tech executives to try to stop Canada from regulating these major tech companies to make them better align with our values and how we would expect for them to operate in our country. That there's a lot of reasons to say, yeah, we should have a sovereign cloud. I would argue that should be, more of a public sector thing rather than just relying on private Canadian companies, though we live under capitalism. That's going to be part of the solution. But also to think much more broadly than that, to say, to what degree can we think about Canadian platforms, Canadian services, or working more with allies that we feel that we can trust on open source solutions, like, say, the Europeans, the Australians, maybe the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Brazilians, people who I think we're more aligned with and we can find more commonalities with. And, it's not just a major player like the United States or China that's trying to dominate our markets and gain a significant degree of economic leverage over us. This longer term trend in society, right, where you're slowly beating down this community infrastructure, these communal spaces, the places where people get together, and the expectation that more and more of our interactions should be mediated by technology. And now it's like, okay, let's just cut out the part where you're speaking to another human on the other end of this, and let's just like have you paired up with your new friend is a computer itself. We're getting all this data on you. To me, it's completely irresponsible to think about a government pushing the adoption of these technologies and really making it clear or not talking very much at all about these very serious deficiencies that have been identified with the technology, and they don't really want to engage with that because they're hoping for productivity benefits. If the goal is like to extract all this oil and gas, and the idea is that we're going to sell it to Asia, I think there are already concerning signs that Asia is not going to be the market that we're predicting that it's going to be for this oil and gas. I'm concerned that the vision that we are collectively investing in is one that is really putting us on the wrong path, right? That is really locking us into this dying model of how society is built and works, that is based around US power that we have certainly piggybacked off of for a very long time, but that is really not going to pay off if much of the rest of the world is making this transition away from fossil fuels, and that is going to accelerate.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, Director of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and today we're going to be talking with Paris Marx about personal digital sovereignty, the overall direction of the Government of Canada with regards not only digital issues and technology issues, but also the environment and energy issues and how those things tie into each other. And there is a guide that we will link to in the description that Paris has written up on how you can improve your digital sovereignty and reduce your reliance digitally on the US as an individual, but maybe with application to your organization or where you work as well. So please do go check out that guide. We've recorded this conversation back in November 2025. So it is now January 2026. Things have changed since. I do want to note that on a couple of the files since we recorded this interview, things have actually gotten better. The government's response has gotten marginally a little bit better. And I think that is down to the pressure that is being put by supporters like you, by people with like-minded thoughts on these issues who have been able to pressure them to improve their approach at least a little bit. But there's still a lot of things that are not going well. For instance, our government recently chatted about and then refused to ban the platform X in Canada. I would argue that they should indeed ban it. There are a number of other ways in which we have worrying incursions by US tech platforms and US-backed oil and gas interests in Canada that are continuing. I have still yet to see a dedicated renewables plan from the Government of Canada in any sort of comprehensive sense, and I think that definitely needs to show up, and I'd encourage you to continue writing in, to continue taking action on those files. But I do want to say that there's some evidence since this podcast that your pressure works and that when you take individual actions towards these perspectives, that works too. There's a petition I'll also link to in the description of this podcast that talks about supporting renewable energy in your community, and another petition that we've just put out on Bill C-15 and making sure that the government does not give corporations special exemptions to the law that make them less accountable to Canadians. Again, this is a huge issue in terms of our democracy in Canada, and things like this can actually undermine our sovereignty at a time when we really need it. But obviously, also since the pipeline MOU came out between the federal government and the government of Alberta, a lot has changed. A lot has changed in a global sense with regards to US aggression internationally and what that means and the ways in which oil and gas interests in Canada have been working to undermine our sovereignty. We have some other recent episodes that covered those issues more in depth since this initial podcast was recorded back in November 2025. I will link to those in the description. Please do go check them out. Before we begin today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest from us. And do check out our e-newsletter. There'll be a link to subscribe to that in the description. You'll get this podcast and also lots of updates on the environmental movement in general every week. And we try to keep donation asks, etc., to a minimum for the first year. We are an NGO. You'll probably get some, but it's totally up to you if you want to support us that way. And we really just appreciate the chance to get the word out. We're also in the middle of a membership drive. If you want to find out more about membership in Sierra Club Canada, please do check out the link that will also be in the description just around membership. Thank you. Anyway, here is the interview with Paris. I hope you get something out of it, and do check out Paris's guide, linked in the description, to how to secure, in better ways, your digital sovereignty. Thanks, Paris, for joining me today.
Absolutely. Great to join you again.
So for those tuning in, we've actually had you on the podcast before, but for those who missed that first episode, who are you and what do you do?
How could they?
It was a good episode. Just go back and look.
If you say so. I don't remember. I'm Paris Marx. I host a podcast called Tech Won't Save Us, which is probably what most people would potentially know me from. I've been writing critically and kind of analyzing the tech industry for over a decade now, I guess. So yeah, on top of making a podcast, I write a lot about technology and I guess you could generally say the political economy of technology, how it interacts with politics, society, those sorts of things. Powerful people and companies that shape so much of our lives because of how important these technologies have become. I also do a lot of speaking, occasionally I do some work on policy stuff. I had a white paper at the end of last year called Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty that I wrote with a few colleagues, kind of looking at why we should be taking greater control of the technologies that are used within our societies, countries, however you want to put it. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of what I do.
Well, you're a good person to talk to about AI and stuff like that, I think, generally speaking.
I can talk about AI, yeah.
So, it's interesting you bring up that white paper because the government of Canada is talking a lot about digital sovereignty. And I understand you don't really agree with their approach in some ways. In what ways do you feel they're going wrong and what should they be doing?
It's interesting, right? So I've kind of been watching to see what people like Mark Carney or Evan Solomon, who is the AI minister, have been saying about these things. And certainly there has been increasing discussion about digital sovereignty and in particular having a sovereign cloud, which is what we've been hearing more often, in particular through discussions around the projects of national significance. For people who aren't aware, the cloud is basically just a ton of warehouse-sized data centers filled with servers and hard drives and things like that effectively run the digital platforms and services that we've all become used to, right? And so if you're thinking on the government level, it would run the services that the government offers to the public, but even internally, the way that government is run, all the data that the government has stored on us, that would all be in data centers, right? That would be in what you could call the cloud. And so, if you think about something like a sovereign cloud, then the question is, Okay, so right now, say a lot of the cloud infrastructure that individuals and businesses and even government to a certain degree would be dependent on would be controlled and owned by American companies. In particular, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle to a certain degree. They're kind of the bigger cloud players. And so discussion of a sovereign cloud is to say like, okay, we're dependent on these American companies that have built infrastructures in Canada, or sometimes, we're just using their infrastructures in the United States or in other parts of the world. Maybe we should be doing more of that in Canada, but also with Canadian companies. Or the piece that I would add, and that say my co-authors would add from the white paper I mentioned, would be to say maybe the government should actually be more involved in this. The public sector having like a crown corporation or something like that that is building out these infrastructures. Because one of the things I think a lot of Canadians wouldn't realize is that there is a law in place that the United States passed, I believe it was in 2018, called the Cloud Act, that effectively gives the United States government the right to request any information, any data that is held on the servers of an American company stored anywhere in the world. So they can kind of reach out to Amazon, Microsoft, Google, any of those companies and say, hey, that data stored in those servers up there in Canada that is of a Canadian citizen or that is of the Canadian government, we want access to that. And they would have to provide it. Right. So, yeah, especially at a moment where, we have the United States talking about Canada as a 51st state, though I guess we haven't heard that as much lately, and we've also been basically experiencing what I would argue is kind of like economic warfare from the United States. We've seen the pressure from the United States and Silicon Valley tech executives to try to stop Canada from regulating these major tech companies to make them better align with our values and how we would expect for them to operate in our country. That there's a lot of reasons to say, yeah, we should have a sovereign cloud. I would argue that should be, more of a public sector thing rather than just relying on private Canadian companies, though we live under capitalism. That's going to be part of the solution. But also to think much more broadly than that, to say, to what degree can we think about Canadian platforms, Canadian services, or working more with allies that we feel that we can trust on open source solutions like, say, the Europeans, the Australians, maybe the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Brazilians, people who I think we're more aligned with and we can find more commonalities with. And, it's not just a major player like the United States or China that's trying to dominate our markets and gain a significant degree of economic leverage over us. So yeah, that's kind of like the big picture thing. Happy to answer any questions based on that. But yeah.
Well, no, it feels like because you're saying like if it's an American company that builds a data center in Canada that's storing data from Canadians, you as government can still go in and grab that data, which to my mind is almost like the digital equivalent of letting the US set up an Air Force base. It's like
Yeah,
letting
to a certain degree.
yeah, yeah.
Definitely. And like one of the more egregious things is like we've seen a number of examples of this play out over the past year, right? As we've been seeing the growing threats from the Trump administration, we've also been seeing the increasing kind of fragility of the digital infrastructures that we're dependent on. So earlier this year, I'm sure listeners of your show will know that the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant because of the actions that they have been taking and that they have been directing against the people of Gaza. And after that happened, the United States actually sanctioned the International Criminal Court and the head of the International Criminal Court. Since then, more judges on the court have been sanctioned, including a Canadian judge. But after that occurred, Microsoft actually cut off access to the email account of Karim Khan, who is the kind of head judge at the International Criminal Court. So all of a sudden, this guy who runs the International Criminal Court can't access his email because Microsoft, this American company, cut it off, and he moved to a Swiss service called Proton Mail instead. But then a few months after that, so that happened around March, I believe, and it was revealed in May. There was an article and reporting on what had happened there. And then I believe it was in June, kind of Microsoft legal and public policy person at Microsoft France was in front of the French Senate, over in Paris, and was basically asked, very directly under oath, if the United States asks for data from French servers that is on French citizens, would Microsoft deny that? And they effectively, because they were under oath, this guy who worked for Microsoft France had to say no, because legally they can't, because they're an American company and the United States has this law that says they can get access to this data. I feel like traditionally when we're talking about things like this, we would be imagining that this is something that like big scary China or Russia is doing. They're trying to get our data and we have no control over it. And like TikTok is trying to steal our data and all this kind of stuff, right? But actually,
Do the video from the film of like a bunch of hackers in a room in Russia,
totally, yeah. But it's like, but
injured.
it's like the United States is at this stuff as well, right? And we just because they are traditionally our ally, we tend to act as though they are a safe partner and they're a friend and all this kind of stuff. But actually, there are a ton of vulnerabilities that are there as well. And especially as the United States has turned into this declining power or this power that is like concerned about its place in the world, political system seems to be taking this huge turn. That's a serious threat. And the fact that so much, not just of our government, but of our major companies, of the services that we all use, our American services are hosted on American platforms. That's actually a vulnerability that I think a lot of people, certain people who are like in the know recognize was there for a long time, but now is becoming much more apparent and pretty clear that we need to act on this. The question is just how aggressively we will, how quickly we will, and how effectively we will, and I would hope that we would really go for it. I think it's less clear what this government is planning to do.
And I do think that lack of ambition is something we're seeing in the environmental community. And we'll get to this in another question, but I think it's kind of funny the difference between what we could be doing to put Canada ahead and what we actually are the moment that it seems to come up against this block of, oh, now we have to engage with that American company. We have to talk to them. And now suddenly we're watering down our plan. Seems to be a problem. But I'm curious, a lot of things in the world of artificial intelligence and environmental policy globally have changed since we last talked or grown worse or however you want to put it. For you, what are some of maybe the most, and I'm trying to remember when we recorded our last episode, but a few months, what are some of the most important or disturbing developments that you see and what should people be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so I think there are two there that really stand out to me, right? And so the first, if we're talking about AI and generative AI and what we've been seeing in that space is, of course, we still have these major tech companies and, of course, a bunch of investors that are plowing money into these massive data centers because they want to basically dominate the AI market. And there's a feeling that there needs to be so much more computation in order to power this AI, these chatbots, these image generators, these video generators, based on the belief that this is like the future, it's going to be mass adopted. Of course, everyone is going to use it, even though there are growing signals that is not guaranteed, not set in stone, right? There was this MIT report that came out a few months ago that really called this into question. And I can't remember the specific details off the top of my head, but it was something like 90% of companies or something were really not seeing a return on these AI investments that they were making, how they were rolling them out and these initiatives that they were taking. And just as we talk, if we look at Canada, of course, I'm sure listeners will be familiar that Mark Carney and Evan Solomon are really pushing the adoption of generative AI, not just among the private sector in Canada, but also in the public sector. This is a big part of the budget that recently came out, where part of the savings that Mark Carney is looking for, and François-Philippe Champagne, the finance minister, is really in cutting back on public sector workers and expecting them to use AI more often in order to, I don't know, make things more efficient or whatever, right? But there was a story in the Globe and Mail just today as we talk, November 19th, that only 2% of Canadian companies that have basically invested in generative AI, that have tried to roll out generative AI in their operations, have seen a return on investment for what they have done, right? So it's really not clear that this is something that is really going to pay off. It's something that we should be putting all of these resources, all this capital behind. And of course, if we're thinking about the environmental dimension of this, those infrastructures are incredibly energy intensive, right? Not just to run the computers within them, but also to keep them cool, right? Because anyone that knows it, you run your computer hard and it's going to get really hot really fast. Well, you stuff a building full of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of computers and run them all constantly. That's going to generate a lot of heat, right? And you're going to need a lot of energy to power them, but then also to keep them cool. And so that means you need a lot more electricity. You potentially need a lot more water, depending on the form of cooling that you're doing, right? If you're using water-based cooling instead of just air conditioning. But then based on that as well, where is that electricity coming from? We're seeing this massive build out of data centers. Paired with that is the attempt to find the energy to power them as well. You have a lot of people in the tech sector talking about how nuclear is going to be, the big solution here. And of
Yeah.
course, I'm sure your listeners will know there's a ton of issues with the proposition that nuclear is going to do it. But even if we believed that nuclear was this wonderful, sustainable energy source, they're building data centers now. And that nuclear is not going to be ready for 10 or 15 years if we're being realistic, right?
Yeah, even if we
So
could get it online, that's the amount of time you're waiting to, yeah.
exactly, right? And again, that's assuming that it's actually going to get built, it's actually going to get done. I think there's big questions as to whether that is the case, right? But we have a growing number of reports that really what they're relying on in the moment. Sure, they're making investments in solar plants and wind farms and whatever, but really the bulk of this energy is coming from natural gas, from fossil fuels, to a certain degree, even coal plants, depending on the part of the world or the part of the United States that you're looking at, right? So you're basically having not just this extension of existing fossil fuel infrastructure that was supposed to be phased out at a much earlier stage, but now the life span of these fossil fuel power plants is being extended, but you're also seeing a significant amount of investment in new natural gas infrastructure in particular, which obviously, is going to create quite a lot of emissions in order to power this absolutely useless and even, I would argue, materially harmful technology in many senses, as we're seeing the effects on learning, the effects on people's mental health of dependence on chatbots. Like we can go on and on and on.
Oh yeah, the codependent relationships that was an article that came across my feed, and it's the amount of codependency ChatGPT was creating amongst the huge number of the independency on that was replacing like real relationships with this bot. It's not good for someone. I'm sorry, it's not good for you. I don't want you to be the grandpa here, but I don't. Oh, please, for the love of God, get your kids outdoors playing with their friends, not talking to ChatGPT. But anyway, that's just me.
No,
Um,
exactly right. It's like a continuation of, I would say, this longer term trend in society, right? Where you're slowly beating down this community infrastructure, these communal spaces, the places where people get together, and the expectation that more and more of our interactions should be mediated by technology. And now it's like, okay, let's just cut out the part where you're speaking to another human on the other end of this, and let's just like have you paired up with your new friend is a computer itself. We're getting all this data on you. It's easier to influence like what you're doing based on how this chatbot is built. And for me, like the really concerning part is these stories about people who probably already have some degree of mental health difficulties, and then form these dependencies on chatbots that really cause them to have mental health breaks, and some people get much further than that, right? And have taken their own lives and stuff as a result of these conversations with chatbots, the things that they have been hearing from them, which I think, to me, it's completely irresponsible to think about a government pushing the adoption of these technologies and really making it clear, or not talking very much at all about these very serious deficiencies that have been identified with the technology, and they don't really want to engage with that because they're hoping for productivity benefits or for companies that are going to get really high valuations or something like that as a result of adopting these technologies. To me, it just blows my mind and makes me really angry, to be quite frank. But I did want to pair that. There's the AI story, but especially because you're focused on climate, I think that there's another big story that I have been paying more attention to that certainly intersects with the technology space, but is less about AI. And that is growing number of stories that I'm seeing about countries in the global south moving toward a much more rapid adoption of renewables, electric vehicles, basically technologies that are not based around fossil fuels. And that is not driven, in these stories, you look at places like Pakistan, for example, which has had this massive build out of renewable and solar energy in particular over the past few years. In the cases of these countries, it's not driven by any kind of concern about climate change, really. Like, let's be quite frank. It's about geopolitics to a certain degree, right? And about the fact that so many of these countries are dependent on imported oil whose prices can fluctuate massively, and also creates these significant dependencies on the countries that are selling the oil, and in particular on the United States and the US dollar. And it seems like there's a growing number of countries in the global south that are recognizing that, in part because the prices of solar panels have become so cheap, is that if you adopt these technologies and you reduce that dependence on foreign oil imports, then all of a sudden you're gaining back more sovereignty, more control over what's happening within your country. And this is kind of part of these broader conversations that are happening about the United States and about the role of different powers in the world. But especially kind of coming off the back of COP30, I know it's still ongoing at the moment as we're talking. It does increasingly look like, especially as we're seeing this version of the United States under Trump 2.0, that we have this one world order that is really dependent on, has been built up around fossil fuels, dependence on fossil fuels, selling fossil fuels to the world in order to maintain its power over everybody else. And then this other order that I would certainly not say is benevolent, but is based around this notion that, we should be electrifying more of society. We should be using more renewables. That, of course, is based around China and the fact that China has been able to dominate these technologies and these sectors. And I think that there are issues with renewables as well. If we're talking about a mass adoption of renewables, especially an energy intensive version of that's very, very heavily reliant on electric cars, there's still a lot of mining that goes into that. There's still a lot of kind of harmful production that goes into that. But I still think it's kind of like obviously the better alternative from the one that we have now. And it feels like to have this like United States that is trying to protect the model that allowed it to have the power that it has in the world at the moment, even as a growing number of countries are recognizing that isn't working for them. The actions of the US government over the past year have cemented that for many of them. And we're seeing this growing, again, like it's not a concern about the climate, but this kind of like economic and geopolitical realization that adoption of renewable energies, adoption of greater electrification over dependence on fossil fuels is actually going to give them more autonomy, which a lot of these countries crave, right? And
Well,
they have suffered immensely over many decades because of that dependence on the US dollar and on foreign oil imports.
Well, and even in Canada's case, and I mean, I agree with you. I don't think like it's not climate, right? These countries are. I was having this conversation with a couple of people recently. At a physics level, renewables just make more sense than oil and gas. I mean, when you really think about it, you are digging this stuff up out of the ground. You have to transport it, burning more fuel to get it to another place in order to burn it to generate electricity. Versus a renewable that creates electricity that you ship through a power line to a location, use, or you can store in a battery if you've got to store it. You can store via pumped hydro if you've got to store it on a micro scale, right? There's all these things that just make renewables baseline more cost affordable, more efficient, better investment. And the cap
And
has,
this is the thing in places like, say, Pakistan or parts of Africa,
yeah.
where grid infrastructure is nothing like we have in the West and in richer countries, right? But if you stick solar panels on people's homes, they might not have energy 100% of the time, or maybe there'll be these like smaller regional grids or whatnot, but it's a much more dependable access to electricity than potentially what they have had in the past as well, right? And as solar panels become as cheap as they have become over the past few years, it's not just that governments can easily buy a lot of solar panels and kind of build out, which is, of course, what we've seen in Pakistan, where there's been this huge build out of solar capacity. But it just becomes easier for average people, even in low income countries, to get a few solar panels and then to have more regular access to electricity that way, right? Rather
Well,
than having to rely on fossil fuels and stuff like that.
well, it's renewable energy democracy, which is a big part of our work at the club as well. And again, like, okay, take Pakistan, right? Does not have a modern grid and yet is able to do this. Now take Canada doing that. with the grid, and you can do the storage. And now you don't have intermittency because your grid is connected and you have storage. So actually you can run everything off of renewables pretty easily because it's sunny in one place, it's windy in another. The energy can be transmitted and stored. We're just seeing once that happens, there is no, and it's even with data centers in the EU. I was reading a very interesting article where they do not want to be powered off of gas. Again, not because they're climate conscious, but because it's more expensive. Like they'd much rather go to a Nordic country that has a renewable grid and power their data center off that than they would go to Germany and power it off of LNG, which is part of the reason why the case for LNG in Europe has been massively oversold, is not accounting. So, there's a certain point at which from Canada's perspective, yeah, we're going to have to build up some data centers, as you say, because we do need to transfer the data we have on US servers to Canada, right? Ideally, in Canadian-owned companies or government-owned, whatever you want to say. But those data centers should be powered by renewables. They should be Canadian-owned one way or the other, and they should not be. They should be doing the minimal impact, not doubling down on AI, as you say, usage, which tends to increase that impact quite a bit.
Well, and there's two things there, right? The first on the data centers locally, Bell, for example, our benevolent telecom operator, is planning this build out of a number of data centers across the country. And they have been actually quite explicit that they are not interested in building data centers that are going to be powered by fossil fuels. Basically, they're not looking at building them in Alberta to power them with natural gas. They're looking more at British Columbia and Quebec to power them with hydro, and with renewable energies. And, again, I know that there's issues with hydro and whatever, but it's better than natural gas, right? But then the other piece of that, picking up on what you were saying as well, is that looking at this international picture and how things are going also makes me worried about this strategy that Mark Carney is setting up for the future of the Canadian economy, which seems very heavily dependent, not entirely, but if we look at these projects that he has designated so far, seem very dependent on this notion that we're going to expand fossil fuel production. You look at these like 2 or 3 natural gas projects that have been approved in British Columbia, just for example, out here in Newfoundland and Labrador, where I am, you'll be very familiar, of course. The kind of main project of national significance that is solely in our province, because of course one of the ones that is being considered and worked on is this joint project between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador around the hydro projects in Labrador. But the other one is, of course, the Bay du Nord deep sea oil project that the Newfoundland and Labrador government really wants to see get on this national projects list so it can move forward. Because Equinor, the Norwegian state oil company that is behind that project, is very close to basically having to make the decision as to whether it's going ahead or whether it's going to be dead. The government sees basically the inclusion on this list and the notion that the government is going to help it get over the line as being key to basically ensuring that project does indeed go ahead. And of course, it's one that certainly should not go ahead. But no, I guess basically what I'm saying is it seems like Mark Carney's vision of the future of Canada is very much reliant on a lot more oil and gas extraction and the notion that we'll be selling that oil and gas to the world because it will be produced at a slightly lower carbon intensity than potentially other sources around the world, which I think you can still very much call into question the notion that like Alberta oil and gas is at all clean or something is just laughable. It's insulting, honestly, to Canadians. But if the goal is like to extract all this oil and gas, and the idea is that we're going to sell it to Asia, I think there are already concerning signs that Asia is not going to be the market that we're predicting that it's going to be for this oil and gas. And the argument that is often made for why it's okay for us to do this on the climate side of things is that, okay, we are going to extract all of this additional natural gas, but that is going to allow China or India or whoever to reduce the dependency on coal because they will be using a less emissions intensive fossil fuel in natural gas that comes from us instead. And there was actually recently research out of Australia that I saw Gatan Joshi sharing, which suggested that Australia basically had this very similar strategy. And that is not how it played out in Australia's case at all. It was not a kind of like substitutional kind of relationship where you had the higher emission fossil fuel being replaced with the lower emission fossil fuel. That was not what happened. And I think it's pretty clear that that is not what is going to happen in Canada's case either, even though we've very much adopted this climate denial talking point that is a justification for the expansion of oil and gas production here.
Well, yeah, and exactly. And I think, Australia is also just a lot closer to that market and they couldn't make it work.
They've still sold a lot to them. Don't get me
They
wrong,
sold
but
a lot. I managed to raise their own prices for gas for people who are using it locally in the process, right? Because now suddenly it's the world price that you're selling on, and that's what's happened everywhere. We start exporting LNG. It's like people's local gas prices go up. We're already seeing the health impacts of LNG Canada on people. The gigantic plume of smoke, people reporting respiratory issues, and again, there just isn't, if particularly for LNG and oil, there's no market in even the medium term. So, we might subsidize these companies a lot. They might operate for a little bit. They might sell a bit of gas, and then we shoulder the costs, which is how they manage to make a profit. But we actually end up paying all of the costs. And again, like Slism's LNG, that's an American-owned company, ties to the Trump administration from the financiers. Is that really who? I've seen, it's ironic. After that I've seen the people I normally think of as climate deniers turn out and criticize Mark Carney for that. You have to you have to really mess up to get us agreeing on anything, right? Like it's a special kind of messing up that has to take place. And as well, even with the oil companies, right? Like Enbridge just came out the other day saying that they see the market as the United States. They want to strengthen ties there. They're not interested in this pipeline west. That being said, there is some sort of announcement today in the Globe and Mail about a new pipeline agreement in principle, MOU, that would, whether or not it doesn't appear to have any sort of actual private backer still, so it's kind of an MOU about nothing. But there's this MOU that, Alberta might be signing with the federal government to allow a pipeline to go west, which includes diminishing or removing climate policies. What do you think about that? And I mean, a key concern of mine is anti-greenwashing laws, that at a very base level, we should know whether or not these projects are actually green or are they actually viable. But I'm curious to get your thoughts.
yeah, well, you literally have Mark Carney himself often going out and talking about decarbonized oil. So I don't think he's someone who really cares very much about anti-greenwashing laws when he's really, literally like engaging in this disinformation himself, right? It was interesting actually to see him. He has been using this language in Canada and not getting as much pushback as he should be getting for it, from the media, from the people who often ask the questions. And it was interesting to see him over in Asia recently. And he was on this panel and he kind of dropped the line of decarbonized oil and then quickly went, but that doesn't include scope 3, because I think he realized in the room he was in that it would have quickly been pointed out that is bullshit, right? But it's been easier for him to get away with it in Canada in talking about these things. But to get to your kind of question about the stupid MOU, yeah, there has been talk of there being some sort of an agreement in the cards between the federal government and Alberta for some time. So I don't think it's really surprising to see that close to happening. I think it's very disappointing, right? Because Mark Carney has already been rolling back environmental laws, environmental legislation, climate policy, like whatever you want to refer to it as. It was actually kind of laughable the other day when the budget was about to pass and Elizabeth May came out and said that, oh, she knows that Mark Carney is a good man because he said in Parliament that he's going to respect the Paris Agreement climate targets. And it was like, okay, but how is he going to meet those targets when he's literally rolling back any policy that was basically trying to ensure that we're going to meet it? It just seemed entirely foolish to me. But what we're seeing here is, like I was saying, and the MOU kind of fits into this real poverty of imagination for what Canada could be, for what the future of the Canadian economy could be, that is very much going back to like the most base instincts of what Canada is, which is kind of like a resource extraction colony, and doubling down on that, whether it's mining projects, whether it's oil and gas projects. This seems to be Mark Carney's vision of what, a sovereign Canadian economy, or, a Canadian economy that is less linked into the United States supposedly, is going to look like. And I just think it's like, has the least imagination possible. It feels like really just hard to understand where this goes, how this is the vision that we're going to have, and how there's any view that this really works out in the long term, other than just being like maybe some kind of short term boost. But then, as you were saying, we need to pay a ton of costs as a result of these decisions in 5 or 10 years because one, the business case has not actually worked out as expected, but also now we have all this like environmental cleanup and stuff like that that we have to pay for because the companies always get away with that, right?
Well, again, even just Alberta, right? Like the amount of well cleanup, orphan well cleanup
Oh
that
my God,
right?
exactly.
Like, I mean, and the environmental disasters have happened that they've never really paid in to have to, on any significant level, to have to clean up. The massive under emissions reporting. I mean, yeah, there's all those things. I think the other thing is just, and there's the argument that the government is calling their bluff somehow, that, you know, that they don't actually have business plans for these projects. My concern, though, with that is you're removing these climate, and they are interested. They want to ship oil to the United States. And again, they talk about lack of vision. Where does that leave us in 10 years if we've helped support this industry building more connection to the US? And we never really, and I've yet to see it from the government. And he's truly ambitious. We're going to build a nationwide grid. We're going to, you know, invest in renewable energy here, 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 and here. We're giving, here's a huge amount of money. Your community wants to go renewable. Let's make it work, right? Let's create some localized jobs out of renewables. That I have not seen. And so even if it is calling this bluff on the oil and gas industry and saying, yeah, okay, build your pipeline to nowhere, or, you know, keep proposing it, right? Where's the ambition on the other side of that to actually build the alternatives that you need if that's going to be the case? Because, you know, I don't want to see Albertans out of work. I don't want to see Alberta. All right, Newfoundland and Labrador, right? I'm from there as well. And like, I don't want to see people out of work. I think Equinor is lying about the viability of Beta Nord. They have been for years. I think that they've been leading people on because they're in that situation, that bubble of not being able to admit this isn't viable, and they don't want to be the first company to turn around and say, actually, the economics of new oil and gas expansion doesn't work. But that's resulting in leading a bunch of people on and believing that's going to happen. It's always just along the thing. Even if they could get it online, I mean, it's going to run for a couple of years and be defunct anyway. So again, it's like I want to see the actual rollout of solutions here, but that requires the federal government actually taking the lead and doing something about it. And there's more to that than, and you need the climate policies to do that too, because you need to create the incentive on the other side of things in order to push companies to invest more in the actual solutions, not the things that create short-term profit for them, but the things that create long-term benefit for the nation. And anti-greenwashing laws, I mean, that's just a silly one to me. It's like, okay, like even what if you want to argue about do climate policies cost the economy? I would argue they don't flat out, because that's just not the way that they work. But anti-greenwashing laws are literally just laws to prevent companies from lying. That's it. Like, that's the point. They can't lie. And then bringing out a bunch of information is not useful if it's all lies, right? Like, on that note, I'm curious about a couple of things. Number one, just on the tech space, what can people be doing? What should people doing to call on government to do more? And also, if people are concerned about like their personal digital sovereignty, I know you did a whole episode on this, so I'm
Mhm.
not asking you to redo that episode, but maybe just a few pointers, and we'll link to that episode below.
Sure thing. Yeah. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you were saying there as well, right? Like my biggest concern right now is obviously we're in a place where we're trying to like redefine the Canadian economy to a certain degree and like reimagine how it's working or however we want to put it, right? I'm concerned that the vision that we are collectively investing in is one that is really putting us on the wrong path, right? That is really locking us into this dying model of how society is built and works that is based around US power that we have certainly piggybacked off of for a very long time, but that is really not going to pay off if much of the rest of the world is making this transition away from fossil fuels and that is going to accelerate in the years to come, right? And we have apparently decided that we are going to extract more fossil fuels, not less. We're not going to take the kind of rapid action that's necessary to reduce our emissions at home, because we have already been delaying on that for years and years and years and years and years and are not doing what's necessary. We can have a debate about electric cars, and to me, they're certainly an imperfect transportation solution. We should be investing way more in public transportation and cycling, and in kind of changing our communities to make them less to make them less carbon intensive. Yet we see in the budget that the fund for public transit investment is actually being cut by the Carney government, not expanded. And but even then, it's like, okay, if we believe that electric cars are the way to do this, even that is getting hampered, right? Because the United States doesn't want to do it now, and because we're tied into their car market and don't want to anger Donald Trump. The kind of EV targets that we had have been delayed by Mark Carney. We don't know what kind of the long-term plan is going to be. We don't have the incentives for people to buy electric vehicles anymore on the federal level. And there was talk of them returning in some form, but we haven't seen that as far as I'm aware. And I think if we were serious, and this is what we're seeing in many other parts of the world, about rapidly adopting electric vehicles, we would probably be talking to China about reducing the tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, right? And we don't seem to want to have that conversation, even though we have a long history of allowing automakers from other parts of the world into our market and basically saying, listen, you can come sell in Canada or in, North America as part of this broader agreement. But in this moment, I think we would be talking about Canada or Canada and Mexico and saying, if you want to do that, that's fine, but you need to build a plant here and you need to be, making at least a certain degree of the vehicles that you're selling in Canada. And the ones that you sell in Canada would be tariff free. And the ones that you're bringing in would still have a certain degree of tariff on them, recognizing that we are not getting kind of the commercial job benefits from that, right? We've done that with Korean automakers. We've done that with Japanese automakers. We've done that with European automakers. I don't know why we wouldn't do the same with Chinese automakers when it's very clear that they are leading on EV technology. We're not going to be able to leapfrog them on that. And we should be, at some point, they will enter the American market. I have no doubt about it. And we should want to try to get some of those jobs here first, especially at a moment when the US government is literally trying to take the jobs that we have from the American auto manufacturers and move them south. But yeah, I just think like the whole model is just so wrong.
Do you have any thoughts on like individual digital sovereignty?
Yeah. And so that's my bigger point on the economy. But like, to get to the question that you were asking, right? I think that there's obviously pressure that can be applied to the government to try to make sure that they are actually concerned about these tech issues. I would say I think we need to be realistic. And at the moment, we have a government that, while they might want to talk a little bit about digital sovereignty, they're much clearer that they're interested in investment. And if that investment is going to come from American companies being made in Canada, then they're very open to that. And I think that they're less concerned about the consequences of depending on these infrastructures. And that's why it's important that we do have some degree of pressure, whether that is from the different activist groups and things like that within Canada, to be able to push. But then, if Canadians are doing things as well to try to move that along, that certainly helps, right? If we're talking about this, if we understand these issues, if we understand the issues of this dependence on these American tech companies, I think that helps to move us in the right direction, even if we have a government that, like on climate policy, I would argue has been moving in the wrong direction on tech policy as well. For Canadians generally, if you're thinking about on the individual level, like, I do think that we need the government to actually be making investments to actually give us the options that are not there at the moment. But there are things that people can do to try to get off of these US tech platforms, right? And as you mentioned, I did an episode on it. I wrote a guide on it. But there's a lot of European alternatives. There's some Canadian ones, though not as many. You want to look for like alternative email providers or a different kind of search engine, or, maybe a different navigation and maps app. A lot of these things do exist. They might work a little bit differently. They might always not be as good as the ones that you're used to, but I would say in many cases, they can be quite passable. And so, as I mentioned, I have like a guide that I put together, try to help people through those decisions. And I think the goal is not like, you need to replace everything. But, if you start to switch out some services, maybe that makes a difference. Maybe that helps to create a market for those alternatives that harder to kind of finance and make work at the moment. Given what's happened with our relationship to the United States, that we should be looking to do that as much as possible.
For everybody who's joining in, what else have you got going on you'd like to let people know about, and how can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, too many things usually. But I have a podcast called Tech Won't Save Us. I write a newsletter called Disconnect. I post on social media, mostly on Blue Sky, but I'm on some of the other social platforms as well. If you want to seek me out, I'm working on my first book was on transportation and technology. It was called Road to Nowhere. I'm working on a second book at the moment, but it won't be out until fall of 2026, and that's on data centers and some of the questions that we have been talking about here. But yeah, so stay tuned for that. But it'll be a while yet.
Thank you, Paris, again. Always appreciate it.
Absolutely. Great to chat.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. And do check out our e-newsletter. There'll be a link to subscribe to that in the description. You'll get this podcast and also lots of updates on the environmental movement in general every week. And we try to keep donation asks, etc. to a minimum for the first year. We are an NGO. You'll probably get some, but it's totally up to you if you want to support us that way. And we really just appreciate the chance to get the word out. We're also in the middle of a membership drive. If you want to find out more about membership in Sierra Club Canada, please do check out the link that will also be in the description just around membership. Thank you.